There are certain symbols in history that the moment you hear their name send a chill down your spine. One of the most infamous is the Iron Maiden, also known as the Virgin of Iron. If you have ever wandered through a European museum, you may have seen it, a towering sarcophagus of iron shaped in the likeness of a woman. Her face, often sculpted with a serene expression, might seem calm, even gentle. But open its heavy doors and what lies within is anything but gentle. Inside, the hollow chamber is lined with dozens, sometimes hundreds of cruel, iron spikes glinting in the dim light. According to legend, when a victim was forced inside and the doors slammed shut, those spikes pressed into their flesh from every direction. They could not move. They could not breathe freely. Every shallow breath, every slight shiver of panic drove the spikes deeper into their body. And yet the spikes were placed with a terrifying precision, not aimed at the heart or brain, not meant to kill instantly. Instead, they pierced the arms, the legs, the shoulders, the abdomen, slow wounds that would bleed, but not enough to bring a mercifully quick end. The victim was left to die slowly in darkness, suffocating, bleeding, and utterly alone. It is a nightmare so vivid that one might wonder, could such a device truly have existed? Was the Iron Maiden a real instrument of medieval cruelty, or is it nothing more than a grisly myth born of imagination and fear? The Middle Ages have long been painted as an age of shadows, an era of heresy trials, of public executions in the town square, of witches burned at the stake, and dungeons echoing with screams. In such a world, the existence of a device as monstrous as the Iron Maiden seems almost believable. After all, what better symbol of the so-called Dark Ages than a coffin of spikes disguised in the form of a gentle maiden embracing its victims in death? And yet history is rarely so straightforward. Some historians argue that the Iron Maiden never truly existed in medieval times. Instead, they suggest it was a story woven centuries later, perhaps in the 18th or 19th century, when Europeans developed a morbid fascination with the horrors of the past. Museums and travelling shows displayed gruesome torture devices, sometimes authentic, sometimes reconstructed, and sometimes entirely fabricated. Among these exhibits, the Iron Maiden stood out as the ultimate icon of cruelty, drawing crowds eager to shudder at the terrors of barbaric medieval justice. But whether real or imagined, the Iron Maiden holds a strange power. It is at once a symbol of human brutality and a monument to human imagination. To believe in it is to believe that men and women once built a machine designed not only to kill, but to prolong agony, to make death an experience of fear and humiliation. To doubt it, however, is to confront an equally chilling thought. Perhaps the Iron Maiden was never used, but we imagined it anyway, because our minds are capable of dreaming up tortures even worse than reality. So which is more terrifying, the existence of a coffin of iron spikes or the dark corners of the human mind that could invent it? In this story, we will journey into the shadowy legend of the Iron Maiden. We will explore its design and the horrifying way it was said to function. We will trace its supposed origins from whispered medieval accounts to its appearances in later centuries. We will weigh the evidence. Was it truly used in dungeons and torture chambers, or was it merely a spectacle for curious museum goers in later times? And finally, we will compare it to the very real instruments of pain that we know did exist. Devices whose cruelty was not imagined but written into the annals of history with blood. Prepare yourself, for this is not only a tale of iron and spikes, but a tale of fear, imagination, and the shadows that linger in the human soul. The Iron Maiden may never have claimed a single victim in reality, but in our minds it has imprisoned countless souls, and it continues to haunt us centuries later. Description of the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was not merely a coffin of spikes. At least that is how the stories go. It was a carefully designed chamber of torment meant to break both the body and the spirit of its victim. To picture it, imagine standing in front of a towering structure of iron, taller than a man, its doors shaped into the figure of a woman. From the outside, it may almost resemble a religious idol or a funerary monument. But once opened, its true purpose becomes horrifyingly clear. Inside, the cavity was narrow, so narrow that no person could enter, without their shoulders brushing against the cold metal walls. Dozens of spikes jutted inward at precise angles, waiting to pierce flesh. They were not arranged to kill swiftly. Instead, they were positioned to wound deliberately. The spikes would pierce the torso, the thighs, the arms, and even the cheeks. A victim forced inside could not step forward or lean back without being impaled further. They were trapped in an iron embrace, unable to move, unable to escape. What made the Iron Maiden so terrifying was not just its cruelty, but its psychological torment. As the doors slammed shut, the world would plunge into darkness. The chamber was not sealed completely airtight. Air could seep in through cracks or holes, but it was suffocatingly stale. The victim would feel their chest tighten as each breath became harder to draw. Claustrophobia would set in quickly. Surrounded by spikes squeezed in a coffin-sized prison, the mind would spiral into panic long before the body succumbed to its wounds. And those wounds, they were crafted to be slow. The spikes avoided the heart and the brain. They punctured flesh arteries and organs in ways that caused bleeding and unbearable pain, but not immediate death. Some accounts even describe spikes tipped with poison designed to fester inside the wounds, prolonging agony over hours or even days. The victim would feel blood trickling down their skin, pooling at their feet, while the iron walls pressed tighter with every trembling movement. Imagine the silence of that chamber broken only by shallow breaths, the scrape of metal against bone, and perhaps muffled cries no one outside could hear. For the victim, time would stretch endlessly. Every heartbeat became torture. The spikes turned their own body against them for even the instinctive rise and fall of the chest, while breathing drove the wounds deeper. Death did not come as a swift blow, but as a creeping shadow inching closer minute by minute. The symbolism of the Iron Maiden was perhaps the cruelest element of all. From the outside, its carved figure often resembled a holy virgin, the image of purity, compassion, and maternal comfort. To step inside was to be held by the arms of this Iron Maiden, but instead of protection, the embrace was one of pain and death. It was a grotesque parody of sanctuary. What should have been a symbol of mercy became a weapon of despair. Whether or not it was ever truly used, the legend of the Iron Maiden reveals something chilling. It is not enough to simply kill. The device was said to strip away dignity, to deny even a merciful end. It was designed to make the victim suffer not only physically, but spiritually, mocking their faith, their hope, and their humanity. In that sense, the Iron Maiden was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical one. For those who believe the tales, few instruments of execution capture the cruelty of the Middle Ages as perfectly as this. A coffin that becomes a tomb, a virgin that becomes a torturer, a slow death delivered in silence and shadow. Even if it was only legend, it is a legend so vivid that it has carved itself into our imagination, enduring long after the so-called Dark Ages themselves faded away. Origins and historical appearances. When we peel back the layers of legend surrounding the Iron Maiden, the question arises, where did this dreadful device actually come from? Was it truly a weapon of medieval cruelty used in the dungeons of Europe to strike fear into the hearts of prisoners, or was it a story stitched together centuries later, a dark fantasy paraded as fact? The first surprising truth is this: there are no clear records of the Iron Maiden being used in the Middle Ages. Chronicles from the period describe executions, tortures, and punishments in painstaking detail: hangings, burnings, the breaking wheel, flayings the rack, and countless others. Yet in these medieval documents, the Iron Maiden is conspicuously absent. Not a single authentic court record, not a single medieval sketch or manuscript mentions it. So when then did it appear? The earliest references point to the late 18th and 19th centuries. During this time, Europe was experiencing what might be called a revival of medieval fascination. The Enlightenment had cast the Middle Ages as a dark, barbaric age of ignorance and cruelty, a perfect foil for the Age of Reason. Writers, philosophers, and later museum curators were eager to illustrate how dreadful the medieval world had been. What better way to do this than to showcase a horrific machine of torture, one that symbolized blind brutality and superstition? One of the most famous appearances of the Iron Maiden was in Nuremberg, Germany, where a supposed Iron Maiden was displayed in the early 19th century. It was said to have been discovered in the city's dungeons, used centuries earlier to punish criminals and heretics. Tourists flocked to see it. The image of the Iron Maiden, an iron coffin studded with spikes shaped like a woman, was burned into the public imagination, but careful investigation revealed something different. The so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was in fact a composite object assembled from various medieval pieces of ironwork in the late 1700s. The spikes were added later, crafted to shock and horrify spectators. It was not an authentic medieval instrument, but a fabrication part museum, curiosity part theatrical prop. This discovery led historians to reconsider the Iron Maiden entirely. Was it possible that the device never existed at all in the Middle Ages, but was instead invented as a myth to attract attention and reinforce the idea of medieval barbarism? Many scholars now believe so. They point out that devices resembling the Iron Maiden's spiked sarcophagi or maiden-shaped coffins were not documented until long after the Middle Ages had ended, and yet the story is not entirely without roots in older traditions. Some believe the concept of the Iron Maiden may have evolved from tales of ancient punishments. For instance, in the writings of St. Augustine, there is a reference to a cruel execution method in which victims were placed into a spiked bronze statue. Other scattered references describe similar contraptions in antiquity. These may have inspired later imaginations, giving rise to the legend of the Iron Maiden. By the 19th century, the Iron Maiden had become one of the most famous torture devices in popular culture despite its dubious origins. Writers described it in lurid detail. Museums displayed reconstructed versions, sometimes claiming they were authentic relics of the 13th or 14th century. For audiences of the time, especially during the Romantic era, when there was a fascination with the macabre, the Iron Maiden was irresistible. It was terrifying, grotesque, and unforgettable. In truth, the Iron Maiden may be best understood not as a medieval tool, but as a symbol invented in modern times to embody our darkest perceptions of the past. It was not forged in the smithies of the Middle Ages, but in the imagination of later centuries, an invention designed to horrify, to entertain, and perhaps to remind us of how far we believed we had come from those dark days. Yet even if it was never real, its legend became real enough. To this day, the Iron Maiden looms large in our cultural memory, a terrifying icon of cruelty that may never have claimed a victim, but still leaves us trembling centuries later. Debate over reality, myth versus fact. The Iron Maiden stands at a strange crossroads between history and myth. Few devices in human imagination blur the lines so completely. Was it truly an instrument of medieval justice, or was it a dark invention of later centuries fabricated to terrify and to entertain? Historians have long debated the question. On one side are those who argue that the Iron Maiden was little more than a 19th century forgery, a macabre curiosity built from scraps of iron and medieval armour. These skeptics point to the absence of any solid medieval records describing its use. Medieval chroniclers were meticulous in recording punishments, both as historical documentation and as moral lessons for future generations. They describe the rack, the wheel impalement, burning, flaying, boiling alive, but not once does the Iron Maiden appear in their writings. The evidence of fabrication is compelling. When the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was investigated, it was revealed to be a composite creation, assembled from parts of a medieval shrine, old iron works and newly added spikes. Far from being a relic of the 13th century, it was likely pieced together in the late 18th or early 19th. In short, it was an illusion designed for display. Yet despite this, many people are reluctant to dismiss the Iron Maiden entirely. Why? Because it fits so perfectly into the popular image of the Middle Ages. The very phrase Dark Ages conjures images of dungeons, torture chambers and ruthless inquisitors. The Iron Maiden feels believable even if the evidence for it is lacking. Some point to earlier writings as possible inspirations. For instance, in the 2nd century BC, the historian Polybius wrote about a Spartan tyrant who executed a criminal by placing him in a hollow bronze statue lined with spikes. Later, Christian authors like St. Augustine also referred to cruel punishments involving spiked enclosures. Could the Iron Maiden have been a medieval reinterpretation of these ancient tales? If so, perhaps the concept existed in folklore or oral tradition even if no actual device was constructed. There is also the possibility of misinterpretation. Medieval Europe did have iron coffins, sarcophagi, and reliquaries shaped like figures of saints or virgins. Some were ornate and frightening in appearance. Later generations encountering these strange objects may have imagined that they were instruments of torture rather than sacred artifacts. A shrine could become in the imagination a deadly machine, but perhaps the most telling part of the debate lies not in the history, but in the psychology. Even if the Iron Maiden was never real, people wanted to believe it was real. It satisfied a morbid curiosity about the past. In the age of Romanticism, when Gothic literature and dark medieval imagery captivated the imagination, the Iron Maiden became a perfect symbol of cruelty. It was terrifying enough to fascinate, shocking enough to sell tickets in museums, and believable enough to endure in the cultural memory. So what is the truth? The overwhelming consensus among modern scholars is that the Iron Maiden was not a medieval tool of torture. It was most likely a myth fabricated or exaggerated centuries later. Yet that conclusion does not diminish its power. In fact, it makes it all the more fascinating. For if the Iron Maiden never killed a single soul, then its true power lies not in iron and spikes, but in human imagination. And in some ways, that is even darker. To create such a vision to dream up a coffin of spikes and imagine the suffering within tells us something unsettling about ourselves. It reveals our capacity to envision cruelty, to design torment in our minds, even if we never build it in iron. Thus the Iron Maiden remains both real and unreal. It may never have existed in the dungeons of medieval Europe, but it exists vividly in our culture, our stories and our nightmares. And perhaps that is why it endures not as an artifact of history, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the human mind. Comparison with real medieval torture devices. Even if the Iron Maiden itself was never real, the Middle Ages did not lack for cruelty. In fact, the period was marked by a chilling variety of instruments designed specifically to inflict pain, humiliation, and fear. By comparing the Iron Maiden to these genuine devices, we begin to understand why its legend was so believable. After all, when reality is already horrifying, imagination needs only a small push to create something worse. One of the most infamous medieval tools was the rack. It was deceptively simple, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's hands and feet were tied to ropes, and the rollers were turned, slowly stretching the body. Joints dislocated, muscles tore, and bones sometimes snapped under the strain. Victims screamed as their bodies were pulled apart, often confessing to crimes they may or may not have committed. Unlike the Iron Maiden, which supposedly killed, slowly the rack was primarily about extracting information, though many died from shock or internal injuries. Another was the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. This was an execution device where victims were tied to a large wooden wheel. Their limbs were then shattered with a heavy iron bar bone by bone. Once broken, the mangled body was woven through the spokes of the wheel and left on display often for days as a warning to others. The breaking wheel was not just torture, it was theatre, a public performance of pain and death. Then there was impalement, a punishment infamous in parts of Eastern Europe. Victims were forced onto a sharpened stake which was driven through the body, sometimes entering through the rectum or abdomen, and exiting through the chest, shoulders, or even the mouth. Death was agonizing and slow, often lasting for hours. Compared to such brutality, the Iron Maiden's imagined spikes seemed almost tame. Medieval Europe also used devices like the thumbscrew, which crushed fingers joint by joint, and the pear of anguish, a metal instrument inserted into the mouth or other orifices expanded with a screw until tissues tore. The scavenger's daughter, an English device, forced the victim into a crouch position by binding their head, hands, and feet together, causing unbearable cramps and pressure. And then there was the theatre of humiliation, the stocks and pillory. Though less bloody, these were instruments of psychological torment. Offenders were locked in wooden frames in public squares, pelted with rotten food stones or insults from the crowd. Sometimes they remained exposed for days, suffering from hunger, thirst, and exposure. When viewed against this backdrop, the Iron Maiden becomes easier to believe. If medieval society was capable of inventing the rack, the wheel, and impalement, why not a coffin lined with spikes? The Iron Maiden felt like the logical culmination of cruelty, a device that combined physical agony, psychological terror, and symbolic mockery. But here lies the irony: the real tortures were already worse. The rack could dismember a body. The wheel left people alive but shattered, displayed as carrion. Impalement inflicted a death so slow and excruciating that eyewitnesses sometimes fainted. Compared to these, the Iron Maiden, as terrifying as it sounded, was almost redundant. This may explain why the myth took hold. By the 19th century, when museums showcased the Iron Maiden, people were already horrified by tales of medieval cruelty. They had heard of the rack and the wheel, and when presented with the Iron Maiden, they believed it without question. It fit the narrative of the Dark Ages, a time when life was cheap, suffering was spectacle, and the church and crown ruled with iron fists. The reality is sobering. Even without the Iron Maiden, the Middle Ages were drenched in blood and pain. Executions were public entertainment. Torture was a legal tool of interrogation. Punishment was not only about justice, but about instilling fear in the community. The Iron Maiden may not have been real, but it did not need to be. the cruelty of the age was already real enough. In the end, the comparison highlights a deeper truth. Sometimes myths like the Iron Maiden survive not because they are factual, but because they feel true. And when we confront the horrors that genuinely existed, we realize that imagination had very little work to do. Cultural legacy and symbolism. The Iron Maiden may never have been forged in a medieval smithy, or used in a dungeon, but in many ways that does not matter. Its true life began centuries later in the realm of imagination, where it took on a power that was almost greater than reality itself. For even without victims, the Iron Maiden has claimed a permanent place in our cultural memory. By the 19th century, the Iron Maiden had become a star attraction in museums. Tourists flocked to see the infamous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg standing before its spiked interior with shudders of fascination and horror. Newspapers and travel journals described it in lurid detail, painting the Middle Ages as an era of unthinkable cruelty. The fact that it may have been a reconstruction pieced together from fragments did not matter. What mattered was its effect. It horrified, and people wanted to be horrified. In literature, the Iron Maiden became a potent symbol of brutality. Writers of the Gothic era, obsessed with the dark and the macabre, eagerly wove it into their tales. One of the most famous references comes from Edgar Allan Poe, who alluded to a similar device in his story The Pit and the Pendulum. For readers of the time, the Iron Maiden embodied the ultimate horror confinement, helplessness, and a slow, merciless death. Art and theatre also embraced it. Illustrations of torture chambers often featured an Iron Maiden in the corner, looming like a silent executioner. Stage productions used replicas to shock audiences, blending fact and fiction into a single grotesque spectacle. To the Victorian mind, fascinated by both progress and the barbarism of the past, the Iron Maiden symbolized how far civilization had come, or so they believed. Even in modern times, the Iron Maiden has not disappeared. It has appeared in films, novels, video games, and even music. The British heavy metal band Iron Maiden borrowed its name directly from the device, making it one of the most recognizable names in rock history. Their imagery, filled with skulls, skeletons, and dark fantasy, drew on the same fascination, with fear that once drew museum crowds to gawk at spiked coffins. Beyond entertainment, the Iron Maiden also functions as a metaphor. It represents the dangers of unchecked cruelty of systems that disguise themselves in symbols of purity or virtue, but conceal violence within. The very form of the device, a maiden, a figure of innocence twisted into an instrument of death, serves as a reminder of hypocrisy and hidden brutality. In this sense, the Iron Maiden is more than just a torture device. It is a symbol of the human capacity to corrupt what is sacred. Psychologists and cultural historians suggest that the Iron Maiden endures because it taps into some of our deepest fears. It is not merely the fear of pain or death, but of confinement, suffocation, and betrayal. To be embraced by something that should be safe, a motherly figure a sanctuary, and instead find agony, is a nightmare of trust turned upside down. It embodies the terror of being trapped, of losing control, of being consumed by something larger and merciless. And so even if it never truly existed, the Iron Maiden has become a real artifact of imagination. It is displayed in museums, replicated in media, and whispered about in classrooms and documentaries. When we think of medieval cruelty, we often picture the Iron Maiden before we picture the rack or the wheel. Its legend has eclipsed the very real devices that once broke bones and spilled blood. In the end, the Iron Maiden may not be an object of iron, but an object of myth. One that reveals as much about us as it does about history. It tells us how we view the past, how we project our fears onto it, and how we are drawn to horror as both a warning and a fascination. Perhaps that is its true legacy, not the deaths it caused, but the way it has forced us to confront the darkest possibilities of human imagination. For centuries, people have asked whether the Iron Maiden was fact or fiction. Perhaps the real answer is this: it is both. It is not a medieval artifact, but it is a monument to the cruelty humanity is capable of imagining, and that in its own way is just as haunting.